our, I don't know quite what you want to call it, our kerfuffle. Anyway, we have one more person coming in, and I think, and then we will start the program. So, Mr. Liepa, whenever you are ready.
I'm competing with Barbie, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, good job. Good job.
Yeah, no, it's good to be back. I do a lot of programs at historical societies, and I served for 15 years on the State Historical Society Board of Trustees. And since I retired full-time teaching, I did teach at Iowa State for a few years and then at DMAC for 38 years, and retired full-time teaching in 2010. And since I've done that, I've done 222 programs all over the state. Not just the baseball program, but I do the one that you're going to hear about tonight on the Civil War. And then I do another one entitled Iowa's Ethnic Heritage. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. If you go to the website for humanitiesiowa.org, that's where the people here found out about. I'm on their speakers bureau. And even though for Ollie I do the programs for free, sometimes they pay me for gas. They actually pay me to do this, but I'm having fun with it. I would do it either way. But it's good to be back, and we're going to talk about a serious topic, but we'll try and keep it, when I taught full-time, 16-week course on the Civil War, any of my history courses I taught, I always told the students that what you're going to get for the next 16 weeks, with apologies to Clint Eastwood, is good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what history is. And so this was a cartoon that was in the Des Moines Register a few years ago. And, obviously a lot of debates still going on over the Civil War. It hasn't stopped, whether it's monuments or what the cause was, or slavery, or what we should be teaching, and so on. And I thought this was, it was in the Des Moines Register, and so I got to thinking there wouldn't be anything to criticize in the future if we just stopped teaching history. It doesn't work that way. And I've got, you've got two people sitting in a bar. It's called the Yeehaw Bar, if you look at it. And obviously that's a KKK guy, and trying to correct history or whatever. But anyway, when I was on the board of the State Historical Society, a lot of you have been to the Historical Society, the building in Des Moines, and they still have the same Civil War exhibit that they've had there for almost 30 years. I was one of the advisors for that exhibit. And a lot of the images you're going to see in the PowerPoint here are taken from the exhibit. And there's a lot of text up there. So I'll ask you, you guys can read. I don't read it. It's one of my pet peeves when people do a PowerPoint, they read everything to the audience. And I like to do that. But we'll try and go slow so you can read these, especially the introductory ones. I'll make some comments. Before I get started, the Civil War didn't start at Fort Sumter in 1861, in April, all right? One of the books I brought with me, I've got 500 Civil War books, but this was a text I used at Iowa State. It's called The Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. They don't get to the shelling of Fort Sumter until page 264 in an 800-page book. So there's a lot more that people need to understand about why we eventually go on killing 725,000 American citizens against each other. So go ahead and pull up the next, is your first name?
Bill.
Bill, go ahead. There we go. All right, and the next one. Yeah, these are things that just won't go away. And basically, I think they're important questions to this day. John C. Calhoun, who a lot of people may be familiar with the name, he truly believed that his allegiance was to his state, not to his country. And we'll talk about him. So I think one thing at the heart of the Civil War is, are you first an American, or are you an Iowan, or as it says up there, a South Carolinian? That's where it starts, is South Carolina. And then the second part of that, should your race, religion, ethnicity determine your political worth in a democracy? Obviously, when this country was founded, it played a huge role in who could participate and who couldn't participate. The Constitution of the United States is a very conservative document. It allowed fewer than 15% of the people that lived here to participate. That's why we've had to amend it 27 times. That's why we have Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause, which allows us to interpret the Constitution, adapt it to changing times, and so on. And so those questions are important questions at the heart of what the Civil War is all about. And our value, personal value, our worth, and so on, in this thing we call a democracy, and how it compares to other people, men, women, black, white, whatever your background is. And then, of course, after the Civil War, you can read those for yourself. I've used that quote from Santayana for years in my classes, and a lot of you have probably heard that quote before. But it's basically saying that we don't learn very well. We don't learn very well. And that can history repeat itself? It's never the same. There was a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, 6th century BC, and he said, think of history as a river, and think about your relationship to the river. You can put your foot in it and stand there, and you're sort of bucking the tide of the river. The river can be a trickle, a small stream. It can be a raging torrent. You can't turn it back, all right? And you can wade out into the middle of the river and be swept away with it and so on. It's one-directional, history is, all right? And we have a lot of options in terms of how we understand and how we interact with history, all right? Some important terms. A lot of you have probably heard these terms, and I took it right from Webster's Collegiate. The word sovereign. Who has the ultimate authority? Is it the people? Is it a king? Is it with the state? Is it with the nation? It's an important concept in understanding what the Civil War is all about. And then I'll go through these just briefly. Ben Franklin and the Founding Fathers were inspired by something called the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Iroquois Confederacy was made up of 5 dominant tribes and then a number of minor tribes. The Mohawk, the Seneca, the Iroquois, the Onondaga, and Oneida, and so on, okay? They would meet twice a year in New York, upstate New York, and they settled prisoner of war exchanges. They agreed to territorial hunting rights and things like that. But the final decision was not made until the representatives from the tribe went back to the tribe, and then the tribe either agreed or disagreed with what was proposed. And so sovereignty rested with the tribe, with the tribe. The Articles of Confederation, that's our first form of government for 4 years. And you can read again, the guiding principle, establish the preservation, independence, and sovereignty of the states. The states have the ultimate authority. 13 colonies, each had its own government. There weren't any standard weights and measures and so on. We tried it for 4 years. Shays' Rebellion shook it up bad. A couple of other things took place. We didn't have money to pay the veterans of the Revolutionary War. It wasn't working. It wasn't working. So they decided in 1786 to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, just the states along Chesapeake Bay, to try and work out disagreements over trade. And then they realized, no, this form of government doesn't work at all. They trashed it, the Articles of Confederation. And that summer of 1787, they met for a number of months before on September 17th, they drafted the Constitution. And again, I put up here the Articles of Confederation, sovereignty, confederacy. That's what we're going to be talking about today, a political union of sovereign states united for the purpose of common action. The last two are important. The preamble to the Constitution, the very first words, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The Articles of Confederation don't work. At first they thought, they were trying to prove the Articles, and they realized after just a couple of weeks, that's not going to work as a form of government. So they go back to the drawing board and spend all those months drafting the Constitution. And then in the Constitution, a lot of people are not aware of this, Abraham Lincoln goes to war because the secession of South Carolina was treason. It was unconstitutional, and it's in the Constitution. You can look it up yourself. I've got a copy with me. I always bring it with me. But it says, no state shall enter into any confederation. And that's what they do. Beginning in December of 1860, and then by February of 1861, they've enjoyed, 7 states and eventually 11 states seceding. Now think about this. We'll get to this. Abraham Lincoln is the least popular president in U.S. history. Eyes roll when I say that. But think about it. He's our only regional president. His name doesn't appear on the ballot in those states. In 1864, when he runs against George McClellan, the South has a president. His name is Jefferson Davis. They don't recognize Abraham Lincoln. He's our only regional president. He wins in 1860 with 39.9% of the vote. That's what he wins with, okay? And it's because they didn't recognize it. Go ahead. I held up the book for a good reason. To understand those 4 bloody years, you've got to go back to the beginning. And this is an outline that was in one of the textbooks I used at Iowa State and at DMAC for a number of years. If I remember right, it was called America and Its People. And if you look on the left-hand side, they'll have approximate dates. the event, and I'll just make some editorial comment as we go down this. There's 3 short pages of these. But slavery is with us from it's actually with us. The Spanish enslaved people in the 1530s. The first African Americans in 1619. That's why you've heard about that 1619 project and so on. A major underlying cause. What I always told my students is that the Civil War, there was the 2 issues that caused the Civil War. Slavery is the issue of the heart. States' rights is the cerebral issue, or the issue of the head. And the reason South Carolina seceded was because of states' rights. Lincoln changes his views on slavery a number of times during the Civil War. I just listened to a program on Frederick Douglass. He was an influence on Lincoln during the war. Remember, Lincoln had married Mary Todd, whose family grew up in Kentucky owning slaves, and so on. Lincoln, for a while, preferred trying to send African American slaves back to Africa. And I think we forget this, that the country of Liberia is named after, American slaves named it. And the capital is called Monrovia after James Monroe, the American president. But not very many that had experienced coming over here as slaves in the hull of a ship for 6 weeks wanted to do that again going back. They liked being here, but not being slaves. 1700s, 1860s, 2 distinct socioeconomic systems and cultures. Let me just give you one statistic first of all. By the time of the Civil War, there were 23 million people in the North. There are 9 million people in the South. At the time of the Revolution, the population was equal. So why the huge disparity by 1861? 4.1 million of those 9 million are black slaves, not considered human. All right? They're chattel. Chattel is a word for movable property, just like sheep or like cattle. All right? There is no middle class in the South. The largest city is New Orleans. There are 10 cities of over 100,000 in the North. There's 1 approaching 100,000 in the South, New Orleans. The second capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, has 16,000 people. What's the population of Jefferson? About a third of that? Whatever it is, 7,000 or 8,000, I think, I'm not sure. 4,000, I gave you way too many. All right. But anyway, so it doesn't grow, the South. It's got a stagnant agricultural-based system, and there's no room for a middle class. Class is very rigid and structured. Even within the institution of slavery, we'll talk about that. The best treated slaves are the ones that waited on the whites in the big mansion. You were better off as a slave with a small dirt farmer that owned 3 or 4 slaves than you were on a large mansion like Thomas Jefferson's or George Washington's. Because you were a lot more valuable if you only owned 1 small family or something like that. If you had 200 slaves, missing of you isn't going to make a huge difference to you. You're wealthy anyway. And it's states' rights, nullification doctrine. Let me explain that. States' rights, as I said, is this belief that sovereignty rests with the state, not with the nation. What is the nullification doctrine? A lot of Southerners were espousing, and again I'll bring up that name John C. Calhoun, that if a state disagrees with the federal law passed by the U.S. government, they have a right through their legislature to pass a law effectively making it null and void. They don't have to obey it. They can exempt themselves from a law they don't like that Washington, D.C. passes. Well, do you have much of a country if every state can pick and choose which laws they're going to obey on certain issues? Our form of government, federalism, is like a marble cake. We have taxes at the federal level, taxes at the state level. We have some things that are primarily the responsibility of the state. We have some things like the defense of the United States. It's the responsibility of the federal government. It's a mix. And it's been that way from the beginning. Nullification is going to become a serious issue by the 1830s. We'll get back to that. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, Iowa's still not a state. Okay, we're not even a territory. But as each state qualified, the requirements, you had to have 5,000 white men in a state, you had to have a governor, you had to have a system of courts and law, and once you met a certain threshold of population, you could apply for statehood. Missouri's ready in 1820, but Missouri's pro-slave. So the debate begins, and they had to carve out a new state up in New England called Maine to balance out Missouri. So we're already debating political strengths and weaknesses long before, 40 years before any shots were fired. 1828, it's called the Doctrine of Interdisposition and Nullification, big fancy word. And it was over a tariff. And tariffs obviously affect manufacturers and large businesses a lot different than cotton farmers in the South that deals with England a lot. And what basically South Carolina was saying is that they didn't want to pay that tariff, so they passed this thing called the Doctrine of Nullification. We're not going to obey it, all right? And Calhoun, I used to ask my classes that from George Washington up to the Civil War, who were three people that had a lot more influence than most of the presidents during those years? John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, and Henry Clay. And you can make an argument for every one of them in terms of the roles they played in American history, how important they were. All right. On January 1st of 1831, a publication published by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. It's called The Liberator. First copy comes out. And all of a sudden, the debate over slavery is ratcheted up. It gets a lot louder. The abolitionist movement is more outspoken. And as you can see up here, the Southern people dig in their heels. No longer is it, something we don't talk much about, slavery. Now they're looking for genetic justification, biblical justification, any way they can to justify owning slaves. So the debate intensifies dramatically in 1831. And you can see on the right-hand side, 30 years of emotional preparation.